to the extent that she possesses the human instrument down to the cells of the body and radiates
There's a
the
lady,
kind of physical
yogi,
emanation of
who hugs
the
people.
gods.
And of course, when I use the word hug, that
Hugs.
describes what it might
Is
look
it?
like if you're watching.
Right.
But from the inside, I understand that in this situation, this particular person whose name I can't quite pronounce was in a state of constant bliss. In fact, it was described as constant orgasmic bliss.
It's very possible, yes.
I mean, these are things that are pretty much unheard of in the West.
True, because I think
And why
the
is that?
full possession by divine power, it goes down to the physical body, and the 5 forms of bliss that Sri Aurobindo is talking about.
5 forms of bliss.
On a constant basis there.
Well, would you say that because of your study of Sanskrit and your exposure throughout pretty much your whole life to this knowledge tradition, that it's made you personally more open to receiving these gifts?
Certainly. I think growing up in India and learning this language, being familiar to some extent with the traditions, made it much easier to be open to these possibilities.
Mm-hmm.
And I see coming to the West that, of course, there's also the whole issue of modernity and the kind of division that modernity brings into our minds. So that it's a much more materialistic understanding that we are invested in, that makes it very difficult to open to these possibilities. But in India, you talk about the autobiography of a yogi.
Yes.
You see there that Yogananda grew up seeing these kinds of people all the time. Now, one doesn't do that. Even when I was a child, I used to go to Dakshineshwar, where Sri Ramakrishna lived. And I remember there were many yogis there. They used to be traveling yogis. But if you go there today, the number of yogis has diminished considerably, and it's become a middle-class place, a place of middle-class pilgrimage. So I think there's been a change, and there's a different kind of more devotional attitude, but also an attitude where these subtler powers have receded a little. But I think still in India there's sufficient openness to these possibilities just under the surface.
Well, let me ask
Well,
another probing question. India was, of course, colonized by the British and I think to some extent by the French.
Yes.
Did that colonization cause the practitioners of yoga and other disciplines to begin to question, the authenticity, the validity of these traditions? Like, how is it that we have a tradition that gives us all these powers, and yet these outsiders can come in and rule us?
Very, very true, Jeffrey. So what happens during the nationalist period? Is quite a few of the yogis are actually at work to help bring about, freedom from these people.
Yeah.
And Sri Aurobindo's own entry into yoga takes place through asking a question like the one that, because he was brought up in England. This is also part of the circumstance of colonization. That his father became an Anglophile. He wanted his children to be educated in England, send them to England when he came back. He saw examples of this kind. He saw examples. He was in West India, in Baroda, and his younger brother came there and started suffering from malaria, a very virulent form of malaria. And there was a yogi beggar who came to the door and saw the brother lying on the bed and said, "What's happened to him?" And he was told he had malaria. So he said, "Bring me a glass of water." And so they brought him a glass of water. He took a knife and cut a design on the water and read a mantra and gave it to him. He drank it and the malaria disappeared. So for Sri Aurobindo at that time, who didn't have any background in all this, he began thinking, is it possible to develop develop these kinds of powers, and can they be utilized to help
I think
us
they can be utilized.
win freedom from colonization? So this is really his
Going through that
entry into
monster
yoga.
shit
And
today.
I think
People in there.
you know, there were
System
yogis.
lord
I think
shit.
one of his teachers was closely connected with nationalism. His first teacher, who gave him spiritual experiences. So I think these kinds of sort of activities were being used in India to achieve its freedom to some extent.
That's very interesting.
Another side of that, Jeffrey, which is I think really pertinent, the Hatha Yoga tradition, which is the tradition of physical yoga, which today has spread all over the West as the yoga studio culture, begins in modern times during the Indian nationalism. And it begins as a form of body politics. Because when you're actually being colonized, then you have to develop tolerance in the body. You have to be able to withstand the colonization of the body. So essentially, these schools started sprouting up where teachers were teaching others on how they could use these forms of physical practice to resist the British and their imprisonment or their
Guess is what I'm gonna have to do.
things like that, and not feel anything. So this is one way by which they couldn't break